In Genesis 11, we're told about the Tower of Babel. This human project was shut down by God because it officially had gone too far. Then God chooses one man named Abram and calls him out of what would later be known as Babylon. See, Abram's origin story is fascinating, especially when you consider his connection to the Tower of Babel in ancient Mesopotamia. He even seems to be a new kind of Noah, and I'll show you why. If you want to learn how to read the Bible, you are in the right place. Let's jump into Genesis chapter 11, verse 5. It says, "These are the generations of Shem. When Shem was 100 years old, he fathered Arphaxad 2 years after the flood." And Shem is going to be the firstborn of Noah here. He fathered Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. So, verse 10, after the Tower of Babel story, a question I have is, why do we get the genealogy of Shem after this whole story when God shuts down the project in the plains of Shinar? We were just told about all mankind across the whole earth and where they ended up, and now we have the focus on one man primarily and his line of descendants. It's as if the world at large, considering the Tower of Babel, the world at large is in a similar condition to the world of Noah's day, but it's not quite that bad. And just like Noah stood in contrast to the rest of the world as God's uniquely different, chosen, righteous one, so we're going to see that at the end of Shem's genealogy, there is a man named Abram who will later be known as Abraham, and his story is set up to mirror Noah in that way. We got Seth's genealogy all the way down to Noah in Genesis chapter 5. So go back and read Genesis 5. You'll see Adam's genealogy with Seth, and then it leads to Noah right before the flood. And now we get Shem's genealogy all the way down to Abram right after the Tower of Babel. So you have two big events with a genealogy on either side. And then Noah and Abraham seem to reflect each other just as Shem and Seth do as their line that God is working with. So God's working with one chosen line once again to redeem the whole. And this is what God does. God chooses to work with people graciously, not at the expense of others and the rest of the world, but actually to the benefit of others. And this is what we're to be. We're to be God's chosen people, partnering with God in the world to bring his kingdom to this dark world. Shem actually fathers his first son, Arphaxad, 2 years, which, by the way, fantastic name for a hamster, a dog, maybe a son, 2 years after the flood. Which means, well, let's think about how old Noah was. Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters came, and he was 601 when he came out of the ark with his family. So is this saying that 2 years after the flood started, or 2 years after the flood subsided from the earth? Or is it just speaking to when God closed the heavens and the great deep after 40 days of nonstop flood waters? Because depending on the reference point, you're going to see that Noah was either 502 or 503 when he had Shem. And Shem, either way, at the end of Genesis 5, we're told Noah had Shem after he was 500, but not necessarily right when he was 500. And this helps us, just by keeping track of the numbers and the years of each character, it helps us really keep track with the generations and the years of each person within each story, so we know where we're at on the timeline of human history. Now, verse 11, Shem lived after he fathered Arphaxad 500 whopping years, and he had other sons and daughters. So Shem is going to live to be 600 years old. And by the time we get to Abraham, the lifespan of humanity has decreased dramatically. Many people will speculate that the new world after the flood allowed for shorter lifespan or made for shorter lives. And possibly that's what's happening. But if it was the case of, the new environment and the new world meant shorter lifespan, wouldn't the lifespan of each descendant, wouldn't the lifespan be shortened immediately? Rather, what we see throughout the genealogy of Shem here is that the lifespans are decreased with each generation. Not immediately, since they come off the ark, but no matter what, we know that God intends to bring us back to the garden ideal. No matter how we see the shortening of lifespans here, whether it's immediate based on the world they're in, or whether this comes with time, each generation, what we do know is that God has a plan to get us back to the ideal where there is no death and there is no limited lifespan, rather eternal life in his presence. And we can live like that's where God is bringing us because he intends to. Now, if you just look at this genealogy as a whole, you get a bunch of names, they fathered this guy, and this is how long they lived. But if you take this genealogy and compare it to the last genealogy, the big genealogy in Genesis 5, with Seth's line, which led to Noah, you're going to see some interesting comparisons. So this time we're working with Shem. The last time it was about Noah, but here we see some differences. In Genesis 5, after each person is said to have fathered a generation, we're told, and he died. And that's assumed here with each person that, leads the next generation and they pass away and then someone else takes over. That's assumed, but we aren't told that directly. If you read each statement, when Arphaxad had lived 35 years, he fathered Shelah. Arphaxad lived 403 and he had other sons and daughters. Now we're going to have Shelah. Shelah lived 30 years. He fathered Eber. Notice you're not going to see any clear statement, explicit statement about, and he died. Shelah lived, 403 years after he had Shelah. Eber lived 34 years. He fathered Peleg. Then he lived 430 years after he fathered Peleg. When Peleg had lived 30 years, he fathered Reu, and he lived another 209 years. So the emphasis here is a little different. When Reu lived 32 years, he fathered Serug. Again, some fire names. If you're having a kid soon, you got like 10 names right here, which would be fantastic. Any child would be grateful to have one of these names. Serug lived 207 years after, or Reu. When Serug lived 30 years, he fathered Nahor, and Nahor had, Serug lived 200 years after he fathered Nahor, and we'll have other sons and daughters seen with Serug. And then the reason we stop at Nahor, or focus on Nahor, is because Nahor had lived 29 years, and then he fathers Terah. And Nahor lived after he fathered Terah 119 years and had other sons and daughters. Then we got Abram. Woo, we did it! But with each person, you notice there's no statement of, and he died. But we're told that directly in Genesis chapter 5 with Seth's line of descendants. So death was a focus in the generations of Adam in chapter 5 because of what had occurred prior with Cain killing Abel, with Adam eating from the tree and bringing death. And in each genealogy, we're reminded, no matter what, that mankind is hopelessly destined to return to the ground from which they came, unless God intervenes to bring us life. So human mortality is emphasized within each genealogy. Our need for God is evident within each genealogy. And there's an anticipation of Jesus, the promised one who would crush the head of the serpent, within each genealogy. And so just like with Noah, we're supposed to see a glimmer of hope with this one called Abram. And so ultimately, these chosen vessels, whether it's Noah or Abram, these chosen vessels are moving human history towards Jesus. They're going to reflect Jesus in certain ways and point to Jesus in certain ways, but only Jesus can bring us back to the garden. So thinking about Shem's genealogy here compared to his two brothers' genealogy in the last chapter, chapter 10, we have Japheth's descendants, we have Ham's descendants, and then we have a few verses about Shem. So thinking about how these three brothers, these sons of Noah and their genealogies are explained, we're told about Ham and Japheth and some of their names, but we aren't told the years of each of their descendants or how long they lived after they gave birth to the next generation. But we see these details in Shem's line. So I just want to notice in Shem's line, I see details that I do not see in Ham's descendants or with Japheth's descendants, which means the story wants us to focus on the descendants here of Seth. It means the story is very much focusing in on them, and the two brothers are fading into the background. And this is the story of Scripture and human history, is that when we get to Jesus, he becomes primary. Everything else is to fade into the background because he's here, and everything finds its proper place underneath Jesus as king. So by the time we get to verse, let's keep going. He fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And this is where things get interesting. We get a little more backstory to Abram and his family. Verse 27, these are the generations of Terah. This is the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran fathered Lot. So this is going to be Abram's nephew. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred in Ur of the Chaldeans. Now, up to this point, we've had no such details about any other descendants. So we're told here that Haran died in the presence of his father, and this is the first clear reference to death in this genealogy. Of course, it's assumed within each passing generation that they pass on the mantle, they fade, they die, and then someone else ends up living through them, right? So they pass on their life to someone else. They give birth to the next generation, but this is the first clear statement about someone dying, and it's in the presence of his father. So what we're told is that Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans. What's interesting is that this is the birthplace of Abraham and his brothers. This will be the place that Abraham and his family move on from. This is the place that will be later known as Babylon. And both of these places are in the region of Shinar. And so when we see the Tower of Babel in the beginning of this chapter, the Tower Project and the city being built in the plains of Shinar, what we have there is the same region that Abraham is born in and pulled out of with his family. So that's fascinating to me, that essentially we're going to see that God is pulling someone away from what will be later known as Babylon, but at this point it's Babel. At this point it's the land of Shinar, the Ur of the Chaldeans. And God is pulling Abram away from that to start a new chapter in this story with a new person he's set apart for himself. So, something to possibly link this to is the story with Ham violating his father Noah in Genesis chapter 9. There's the idea of here we have the son dying in the presence of his father, Terah. Haran dies in the presence of Terah. And then in that chapter, we have the son doing something odd to the father in the presence of his brothers. Here, the brothers are present, Abram and Nahor. So, and thinking about what God called, Noah and his family out of, and here we have Abram being called out. There might be some parallels to that, but in other words, we're to see Abram, which he'll be later known as Abraham, so I might just synonymously use the twos. Abraham and his family are being born in the same region where the Tower of Babel took place. So that story ends, they're dispersed, and then kind of from the ashes of that story, later on we see God select one from among that place named Abram. So Abram's father, Haran, dies, or Abram's brother, rather, Haran dies in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred. So the place matters, and who he's in the presence of matters. There's a sense in which this region, Ur of the Chaldeans, later Babylon, the plains of Shinar where the Tower of Babel was built, this region throughout the Bible will be known for its death, its destruction, its worldliness, its being anti-God for the most part. And God is going to redeem and sovereignly work within that, but within this story, God is going to sovereignly lead Abraham and his family out of Babylon to bring Abraham into a new place, where he plans to write a new story with him and his descendants. This is what God does with us. He pulls us out of the world, out of whatever is not of him, to bring us into abundant life on the other side, that we might live according to his ways in the midst of a world that is very much spiritual Babylon. So we have to ask this when we're told these details. Why are we told about Abram's brother at all? Why are we told anything about Haran? If we're just supposed to focus on Abram, maybe it's helpful to know that Haran died, so that's why there's more focus on Abram. Nahor stays in the region that they're going to be pulled out from, so Abraham's the guy. But either way, why does his death matter for the story, Haran? Why are we given this detail about where he died and the fact that he died in front of or in the presence of his father? How does this relate to Abram's calling? Something to maybe speculate about is it seems as though Haran's death might have been what prompted Terah, the father, to decide, it's time to leave our home and go to the land of Canaan. So we're about to be told that Haran was the father of the one that died, the brother of Abram. He's the father of, Milcah and Iscah. So these two women, and one of Milcah will be the wife of Nahor, and then you have Sarah end up becoming the wife of Abram. And the next thing, Abraham and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarah, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. When you see taking so far in the story, it's not usually for good. Not to imply anything negative about what's taking place here. This could just imply taking into marriage, covenant relationship. But I just want to be mindful of how the story has used this concept of taking. Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve take from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The serpent essentially takes advantage. Cain takes Abel's life. The sons of God in chapter 6 take the daughters of mankind. So there's other, Ham will take something from his father, and to disrespect and dishonor and violate him. So there's been a lot of taking and reaching and power grabs here throughout the story so far. So I'm not going to imply anything negative about what Abraham and Nahor are doing here. But so far, up to this point, a lot of human taking has not been for good. So they take wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarah, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran. So Haran dies, but Milcah and Iscah continue his name. Now Sarah was barren, and she had no child. Now, for those of us that know the Bible, and we know where the story is going, and we know what God does with Abraham and Sarah, we know that this is important for the rest of the story. And the story is setting us up to anticipate something that is going to happen that relates to Sarah's barrenness, and the fact that she is Abraham's wife too. So and that's exactly what we see throughout the story, is that her barrenness and Abraham's lineage are two huge components of Abraham's story. And barrenness doesn't just become a problem, but an opportunity for God to move and reveal his glory throughout the Bible. And this is what we need to learn how to do. We need to learn how to view any barrenness in our lives, any spiritual, emotional, mental, financial, whatever barrenness we're qualifying in our life. We need to learn how to view that as a platform for God's glory, as an opportunity for God to show his glory and move mightily. Because Sarah having no child is going to be an opportunity for God to show himself. And this is a big deal. This means no offspring and no future for Abraham up to this point. And this is the very first time in 11 chapters of the scriptures that we have seen this explicit concept of barrenness very clearly stated. We see like the concept of barrenness relating to the womb and labor and produce and even spiritual barrenness throughout the rest of the scriptures. So this will become a very key theme to look for as you read the Bible. Real quick, if you don't know me, my name is Jason, and I have some free gifts for you at abovereproachministry.com. Go to the website or click the links in the description below to check out all of our free Bible study resources. We have online Bible classes, devotional studies, Bible study workshops, all of my sermon notes, and more. You can even join our online church community on the Discord app. We also have discussion groups all around the world, and if you don't see one in your area, message me and we'll help you start a launch group. I personally lead a group in Spartanburg, South Carolina. If you live in the area, we'd love to have you join us on Fridays for Bible study. So contact me if you're interested, and if you or your church would like me to come preach or teach, just message me or shoot me an email and we'll see what we can do, because I love preaching in person. If you're a new follower of Jesus, click the New Believer section to access everything we recommend for new believers. And be sure to snag a copy of my book, Fruitful, to support this ministry. All right, that's all I got for you. Let's jump back into the video. But verse 31 says, Terah took Abram his son and Lot, the son of Haran. So just like we saw, Abraham and Nahor took wives for themselves. Well, now Terah is taking Abram. He's taking Lot. He's taking Sarah, his daughter-in-law, his son Abraham's wife, and they went forth together from Ur the Chaldeans. Now the idea that it's together might imply that they were in agreement. Acts chapter 7 might bring some clarity to that. But they go into the land of Canaan, but when they came to Haran, on their way to Canaan, they settled in where? Interestingly enough, a place that is named Haran. Who died in the story? Haran. So we're told that Terah took his son Abram, Lot, Sarah, they left, they go to Canaan. We see Abram and Nahor 2 verses earlier take wives for themselves. So is this Terah taking them against their will? Why does Nahor stay in Ur of the Chaldeans? It says, Terah took Abram, Lot, his son, and they went. But when they came, so Nahor is going to be staying in northern Mesopotamia, I believe, which will be referred to later in the story as Padan Aram. So that's where Abraham will send his servant to find a wife for Isaac, or that's where Jacob will be sent to find a wife for himself. So why is it that Nahor stays behind in Ur of the Chaldeans? Could Sarah's barrenness be part of the reason Terah decides to make most of his family move to Canaan? Because right after we're told Sarah was barren, it says Terah took Abram, his son, Lot, and Sarah. And could this be partially prompted by the barrenness of Sarah? And if so, how does moving and leaving become a solution to Sarah's barrenness, or a way to solve and work with Sarah's barrenness? Just something to think about. When God leads Israel into the promised land, that land will be known as a very fruitful, overflowing, abundant land of promise, Canaan. And Sarah here, who is barren, they are on their way to what will be later known in this story as a very fruitful land of abundance and provision and fruitfulness. So, is there a connection between those ideas? Possibly. We're told that along the way they actually stop in Haran and they settle there. And what's interesting is this chapter 11, opens with the inhabitants of the world migrating from the east, and what do? They find a plain to settle in, the plain within the region of Shinar. We aren't told why they settle in Haran here. So maybe a question I have is, was God leading them to leave Ur and head towards Canaan? Is Haran where God wanted them to be at all? Because Acts chapter 7 in Stephen's speech, it tells us that God appears to Abraham in Mesopotamia before he left Haran, which means here, when Abraham is in Ur of the Chaldeans with Terah, with Sarah, with Nahor, with Lot, when they're in that region, God does visit Abram and tells him to leave. So, it seems as though Terah's decision to relocate his family had something to do with God appearing to Abram and telling him to leave and prompting that. But we aren't sure if God told Abram and Terah to stay in Haran. We just know God told them to leave Ur of the Chaldeans. So here's what we know. This kind of settling that we see Abram and his family do in Haran, it's very similar to the kind of settling with the people in the beginning of this chapter in the land of Shinar. It isn't what brings abundant life. It's actually opposed to God's ideal and God's will. Settling in and of itself is not a bad thing. But when people are settling for less than what God has for them, it's no longer a good thing. Humanity always wants to settle along the way to what God has called them to. We get impatient, we get disgruntled, we get bitter, we get confused, we get disoriented. And so we have a tendency to settle for less than what God actually wants to bring us into. And we need to learn how to discern between faith and when it's time to actually trust God and settle because he told us to, like he told the people of Israel in the wilderness wanderings. When the clouds settle on the tabernacle, it's time to settle and stay here for a while. We need to learn how to discern that and just pure laziness and complacency. And sometimes staying where we are is an act of faith and trust in God. Other times it's an excuse to put no effort into our walk. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So what's interesting is the story told us there is one of Terah's sons named Haran who died in Terah's presence. Now Terah ends up dying in a place that seems to be named after, coincidentally, his son that died in his presence, Haran. So is there any connection there? Possibly. But we know that Nahor is back in Ur of the Chaldeans. Abram is with his nephew Lot, kind of stuck with him. He's with Sarah, his wife, in this foreign land called Haran. So Abram will end up leaving here in the next chapter. And Acts chapter 7 tells us that God prompted that. God removed Abraham from this land of Haran to bring him to the land of Canaan that he would give to his descendants. So when we look at this genealogy as a whole, this sounds like the flood story in Genesis 6. God tells Noah he's bringing the flood in 7 days. And if you follow the genealogy, Noah's grandfather, Methuselah, he was alive up until right around the flood. Whether he died weeks or a few months before the flood, we aren't told and we don't know. But possibly the 7-day warning that God gave Noah, hey, in 7 days I'm going to bring the flood, that warning was God allowing Noah adequate time to mourn for his grandfather. But that's not likely all that's happening. That's just a part of what's happening. So in the same way, we have the death of a relative here, a waiting period between when they arrive and settle and when God tells Abram to leave and move, just like he told Noah, go into the ark in 7 days. So there's a lot of correlation between Abram and Noah's origin story because God is transitioning them into a new phase, a kind of new life in a new land. And at the same time, there's a new chapter in this story, starting with this call of this guy named Abram, who comes out of Babylon, out of Ur of the Chaldeans, the place where the Tower of Babel was shut down and discontinued. And in that place, Babylon will rise from the ashes later on in the story and in human history. So just be aware of these things. It's interesting where Abram is called from and where he originates from. His birthplace speaks a lot to possibly his spirituality and his view of the world and his worldview of of life in God and all of that could have been greatly influenced by where he was raised. So I don't know if Abram was alive during the time of the Tower of Babel. That is very likely, but I haven't traced that all the way through. So that's all I got for you guys today. I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough, where we will pick it up in chapter 12 and start this new chapter in the scriptures with Abram. So I'll see you guys in that video. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to share your thoughts and your insights in the comments. If you want to share your thoughts and questions about these studies, join us every Thursday evening at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for a live discussion together. And thank you for supporting this ministry. Your support helps us accomplish our mission, which is to teach people how to read the Bible so they can live and teach it for themselves. We're only able to make all of these free resources because of generous supporters like you. So thank you very much for all of your support. Make sure to visit AboveReproachMinistry.com to check out all of our free resources. And as always, keep moving towards Jesus.